I have taken seminary classes on the Old and New Testament. I have been preaching sermons on all of the readings in the Bible for 8 years now. I have read the Bible cover to cover, or nearly cover to cover in some cases, every year since I was ordained. And often I think that I have gleaned everything there is to be gleaned. And then something happens like happened to me when I read our gospel for today. You see, this gospel that we worked from today was from the Gospel of John. There are 4 gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the synoptic gospels. They are very like each other. John is something a bit different. Those of you who came to Maundy Thursday yesterday heard me say that in the synoptic gospels, at the Last Supper, at the supper before, the night before Jesus was crucified, Jesus institutionalized, he performed that first Eucharist. But in the Gospel of John, instead of a Eucharist, Jesus washes the disciples' feet. The story of the crucifixion is also different in the Gospel of John, and I had never caught it until this time. You see, in the synoptics, the focus is on Jesus' agony, on his crucifixion, and on his death. But John doesn't focus on that. There is no agony in the garden. Jesus doesn't pray for this cup to be taken from him. He doesn't sweat any blood. And even the crucifixion itself is pretty short in John's gospel compared to the most important piece, which is the trial. The trial is both the center of the crucifixion story and the longest sustained scene. This is what is important to John. This is the theological and the dramatic climax. And even though what we have for today is not the reading from John that you would see if you opened up any Bible, you can see how important the trial is in our dramatic version as well. So our dramatic version in the bulletin, the Passion Gospel begins at the very bottom of page 3 and ends on page 14. The bottom of page 3 to the top of page 7 is all intro material. And then from page 7 to from page 7 to the top of page 12 is all the trial with Pilate. And then from page 12 to 14 is his crucifixion and death. The trial is the longest part. It is the climax for John. And in fact, John has been setting up the importance of this trial all along. He refers to John the Baptist's proclamation of Jesus as John the Baptist's witness or testimony. John refers to Jesus again and again and again in his gospel as testifying to the truth. And in John chapter 5, verse 37, he has Jesus say, "And the Father who sent me has himself testified on my behalf." This is way before the trial in front of Pilate. John has both the Father and John the Baptist testifying on Jesus' behalf. He is setting up the scene of this trial. And we might think that this trial in front of Pilate is actually about Jesus being on trial. And it's true. Jesus is on trial. And he is found guilty. Right? He is found guilty. We could say this another way. We could say that God sent his son, and that in the sending of the son, his message, his actions, his offering of himself is challenged on this Good Friday. And that humanity's answer to God's gift in the person of Jesus is no, right? You played the crowd. Crucify him. Crucify him. Their answer to the gift of God's Son was a decisive no. But that is just one layer of the trial that was happening that day. One could argue, and many have, that in our gospel, the Gospel of John, Jesus is not actually the one who is on trial. Humanity is. The world is. We are. And here, Jesus is the judge. Why would I say that? I'll give you a few pieces of textual evidence. Remember, I was an English teacher in a former life. And here I'm only touching the surface. If you go to your bulletin and turn to page 8, for example, Pilate begins his interrogation of Jesus by asking the question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" This is a yes or no question, right? Or it calls for a yes or no answer. But Jesus doesn't give that. Instead, he asks a question himself. Do you ask this on your own? Or did others tell you about me? Jesus, in other words, says, nuh-uh. You are not the interrogator. I am. I ask the questions today. Then on page 9, at the very, very top, Jesus says, "For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Jesus, in other words, testifies, there's that legal language again, testifies to the truth, and people are called to follow. He is not the one on trial here. He is testifying to the truth. Whether people follow or not is what is on trial. Then on page 9, we have the soldiers dressing Jesus in royal garb. They wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they dressed him in a purple robe. All of this is the clothing of kings. And in every other gospel, they clothe him in that, and then eventually they strip him. Only in John's gospel is that clothing left on him. For the whole rest of the trial, he wears the crown of thorns and the purple robe of a king. And Pilate presents him to the people and says, "Here is the man, here is your king." And of course, Pilate means it to be sarcastic. But yet what we have here is the truth. Jesus dressed as a king, being called a king by Pilate. And then there's this bit on page 11. Right in the center of page 11, Tom, as the narrator, read these words. When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside and sat on the judge's bench at a place called the Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. This is how most people choose to translate from the Greek over to English. He brought Jesus outside and sat on the judge's bench. But actually, the Greek is grammatically kind of complex and vague. And so it would be equally correct to read that as saying, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside and sat him on the judge's bench. Now, it's a toss-up. Grammatically, it's unclear. It could be read either way. And there are scholars on both sides of the issue here. But many argue both, that it would be unfitting with Pilate's character to sit Jesus on the judge's bench in mockery and say, here is your king. He's dressed as a king. I'm calling him a king. And I'm sitting him on the judge's bench. That would be in keeping with his character and also in keeping with what John wanted. To turn this trial upside down so that the accused becomes the judge and the judge becomes the accused. So, for John, the climax is the world being put on trial. And that world includes Judas. It includes Peter. It includes Pilate. It includes the religious leaders. It includes the crowd. But it also includes us. We are also on trial. Because like Judas, there are for many of us countless times when we have sold out our Savior for a bit of profit, right? When we have made moral compromises so that we might become richer. Like Peter, for many of us, there have been times that we have been too embarrassed or too scared or too abashed to claim Jesus as our own, to claim Jesus as our Messiah, when we have denied him, either through direct denial or through our own silence, when we might have been called to proclaim the gospel. Like Pilate, there are times for many of us when we have said, what is truth? All of America is doing this right now, right? Fake news. What is truth? Who do we believe? Like Pilate, we have all been guilty, I would guess, of saying at some time, what is truth? And many of us have been guilty of washing our hands of situations that were morally reprehensible and said, they're the ones who wanted this. There's nothing I could do. I was pressured into it. Like the religious leaders, there are times when we have sold out our Savior in order to keep power for ourselves. I know I have. As a priest here, I will admit it, that there have been times that I have stooped to pettiness, to sarcasm, to thoughts that I should not have had in order to try to protect the little bit of power that I have as priest of this parish. When might you have given up on what you knew what was right to protect your power? And like the crowd, there are times for all of us when we just give in to a mob mentality and scream for the wrong thing to happen because we're caught up in something bigger than ourselves. And so on Good Friday, we not only remember Jesus' agony and death, we remember the day that the world said no to God and was found guilty. And we grapple with all of the times that, like Judas, like Peter, like Pilate, like the religious leaders, like the crowd, we said no to God. And we're found guilty. Thank goodness, right, that for us, the story doesn't end here. Thank goodness that Jesus said, if you want the reference, in John chapter 12, verse 47b, I came not to judge the world, but to save the world. Thank goodness that for Jesus, the meaning of judgment isn't to say, you're good, you're bad, here's your reward, here's your punishment, but the meaning of judgment is to set things right. Thank goodness that God, that Jesus doesn't allow the verdict of the court to stand. Thank goodness that God does not answer our no with a no of God's own. But then again, that's another story for another Easter day.